Was it not that big of a deal, Mona?
Well, compared with the kinds of things that Trump does on a daily basis, no, it was really, it was a quaint little few crimes compared to Trump. But you know, this is an example of the ahistoricism of people like Vance. The fact is that it wasn't the deep state who took down Richard Nixon. It was fellow Republicans who, in the end, said, "You know what? You've lied, and we can't stand behind you, and we're not going to stand in the way of an impeachment." And that was what forced Nixon to resign rather than be removed from office. That was back in the day when you still had a sense among people in politics that there were some lines you couldn't cross, that even if it was your side, you still had to hold them to some standards. And Vance lives in a new universe where the only rule is whose ox is gored. And so he would, he thinks it's outrageous that Nixon had to resign.
I mean, to point to Nixon, Susan, and to say, well, you know, Nixon was unfair. It was unfairly treated. How many Americans are there in this country that hear that and say, you know, you're right. I think we need to take a kinder look at Richard Nixon, and then look at J.D. Vance and look at Donald Trump and say, yeah, this is all fine and all good and all normal.
I mean, look, my view is that it's not so much ahistoricism. Unfortunately, I think that would be the better thing if it was just ignorance. I think, and I've thought this for a long time, that for Donald Trump, as well as for J.D. Vance, the goal here very explicitly is to vindicate and to restore and to rewrite history. It's not that they've forgotten history. It's that they think McCarthy was a good guy. They think that Richard Nixon was the model for presidential power and, you know, sweeping assertions of executive authority. I think they think, you know, that Richard Nixon was the guy who, after his presidency ended in disgrace, you know, told an interviewer very famously, you know, that it wouldn't be illegal if the president did it. That is literally, I would say, the sort of motto of Donald Trump's presidency. And in many ways, if you look at their legislative agenda, which is to undo the constraints and restrictions on the presidency, on individual scandal that were put in place to stop the possibility, to foreclose the possibility of another series of Watergate-like scandals. That's what Donald Trump is doing, is systematically rolling back the Watergate-era protections that our system tried to put in place to stop us from having another Richard Nixon. So I see this as an example of J.D. Vance saying the quiet part out loud. Richard Nixon is not a disgrace to be rejected by Republicans, but the model of what this Republican administration is looking to achieve. And I do take Mona's point that the only thing that's quaint is that Republicans on Capitol Hill still had a sense of shame at the brazenness of the presidency. And if you want to say that Hugh Scott is a member of the deep state, then you're probably not historically accurate.
I mean, that, but they also were accountable to voters, and voters were horrified by what Richard Nixon was doing. I mean, it's part of the mythology of Roger Ailes, is he saw what happened during that time, and people hated Walter Cronkite at the time. There was a, Stop Cronkite pins because of the reporting that was being done on Nixon. He thought that if there was a counter to what he determined even back then was the liberal media, like a Fox News, Richard Nixon would have survived. It's part of how Fox News came into being.
He wasn't wrong.
He wasn't wrong, and we're seeing that now. And that's what we're living through and experiencing. I think the lesson here of Nixon is not that what he did wasn't so bad. It's that the rules that were put into place after Watergate were merely rules that could be broken, norms, and not laws that really constricted what a president was allowed to do, Andrew.
But if I may, Katie,
Mona, go ahead.
This ties back into our previous segment, because you began by asking whether Trump's depredations were finally getting pushback. And I think the answer to that is an emphatic yes. It takes time, but it is happening. And one of the things we saw with that Judge Emmett Sullivan decision about the Epstein files was that because the Trump Justice Department has so thoroughly trashed the presumption of regularity, because they've lied repeatedly to federal judges, they have lost all credibility. And Blanche himself was the one who went and visited Ghislaine Maxwell in prison, et cetera. So they have sacrificed that precious commodity called credibility and integrity, and therefore the judge is having none of it. I think this decision about standing actually extends standing in a crazy way, because if a journalist can say, well, I can't report on something and therefore I have standing to sue, that could open it up to just about anything. But I think the reason he stretched to find that way of granting this injunction is exactly because there needs to be pushback to the tremendous, flouting of all norms and standards.
So isn't that to my argument that there needs to be after this administration, if we really want to, wrench back control from an executive who, we have to just rely on the person being decent and moral and unwilling to break rules and to break laws and unwilling to be shameless, as this president has been. Don't we need stronger, stricter laws and guardrails in place going forward, Andrew?
Well, absolutely. I mean, one thing that Donald Trump has shown us in the first and now particularly in the second term is that norms are not sufficient. And he has shown where there are fissures and weaknesses in our constitutional system. And to the one point that J.D. Vance is making that I think is correct is that if Watergate happened now, that it could have been a 12-hour story, but that's not a good thing. That is a bad thing. And that is a reflection on what has happened to Congress and the members of Congress and their willingness to stand up and adhere to their oath of office. It is a reflection of the media and the fact that we're in media bubbles where the story of what Nixon did could be cabined and not told in a fulsome, truthful way to a huge segment of the population. So I'm sure that's not how J.D. Vance meant it when he said that it would go away. And deplorable, and is something that correctly, Katie, as you point out, that if we get through this, there has to be a real reimagining on this 250th anniversary of our country about having tighter guardrails so that we don't have this situation arise again.
So you don't have to just rely on the lower courts to push back, and then the Supreme Court on occasion, especially when you have a Congress that refuses to take hold of its own power. All right, Andrew, Mona, Susan, everybody, thank you very much. Appreciate it.